He was the man religion trusted, a man forged in law, discipline, and blood loyalty. But what happens when the enforcer becomes the exiled? When the most feared name in Jerusalem is the one who ends up on his knees, not by force, but by a whisper? Saul of Tarsus didn't lose his way. He found it, by crashing into a truth that shattered everything he once knew. This isn't your typical redemption arc. This is a story of psychological ruin, divine ambush, and spiritual treason. The kind of change no religious system can explain. And no self-made man survives unchanged. Saul didn't dabble in dogma, he weaponized it. While modern faith influencers romanticize grace, Saul sharpened doctrine into a blade. He dragged believers out of homes, nodded in approval as lives ended. This was no passive persecution. This was holy warfare to him. So when you hear people say God can use anyone, they usually don't mean this guy. Saul wasn't misunderstood, he was deadly, and yet it was him Christ chose. Not Peter, not John. The hitman of the early church was recruited by the Esau. Very king he swore to destroy, and not quietly, but violently. The Damascus road wasn't poetic, it was terrifying. No buildup, no warning. 1 second, Saul is calculating arrests. The next, he's blind, trembling, ruined. No sermon, no argument. Just a question from the divine. Why do you persecute me? What makes this story so disturbing is that Saul was sure he was right. He thought he was honoring God. But that moment proved something haunting. You can be zealous, brilliant, admired, and still be fighting the very God you claim to serve. And when that realization hits you, your soul doesn't just weep. It fractures. Most grace preachers skip the silence that followed. The 3 days of blindness, no food, no vision, no purpose. This wasn't a retreat. It was a breakdown. What's more terrifying than losing your physical sight is realizing you've never actually seen. For years, Saul thought he was clean, righteous, chosen. Now, every prayer he'd ever recited, every law he had defended, felt like a jail cell built by his own hands. This wasn't the beginning of ministry. This was the death of Saul, and the birth of someone unrecognizable. Enter Ananias. Enter the forgotten hero of this story. A man terrified to lay hands on the terrorist who killed his people. But here's the twist. Grace doesn't wait for you to feel ready. Ananias obeyed, trembling. He called him Brother Saul. Imagine that. Brother, not killer, not threat, but kin. That's what makes grace so offensive. It rebrands villains before they've earned it. It names them family while the blood's still drying. And that moment wasn't just about healing. It was about confrontation. Not just of Saul's sin, but of ours. Would you forgive the man who murdered your friend? When Saul emerged, he was baptized. Not just in water, but in fire, shame, freedom, and mystery. He wasn't given a new mission. He was reborn. And yet, the transformation didn't erase his past. It haunted him. The Christian world didn't throw a party. They flinched when they saw him. His reputation clung to him like smoke. This wasn't a clean break. It was messy, suspicious, painful. He became a man with no country, too Christian for the Jews, too Jewish for the Christians. That's the cost of real transformation, isolation. But here's the catch no one talks about. Saul, now Paul, never truly left the law behind. He warred with it, wrestled with it, not as a backslider, but as a man who knew its grip. When he wrote to the Galatians, it wasn't theological. It was personal. He'd seen what rule-keeping does to the soul. He'd lived under the tyranny of self-righteousness. And now, his spiritual children were running toward the same chains he once died to escape. That's not a debate. That's betrayal. And Paul would rather offend everyone than watch grace become diluted. So when Paul thundered, "If anyone preaches another gospel, let them be cursed, even if it's an angel," he meant it. This wasn't rhetoric. This was blood-wrought urgency. Because Paul knew, a half gospel is no gospel. A Jesus plus anything is poison. And when preachers today start packaging salvation with performance, Paul wouldn't write blog posts, he'd flip tables. The irony? Many churches today would cancel Paul. Too aggressive, too intense, too honest. But that's the price of someone who's seen. He wasn't playing preacher, he was bleeding truth. The letter to the Galatians isn't just scripture, it's a spiritual siren. Paul's not just teaching doctrine, he's begging ex-slaves not to return to their chains. He's pleading with a trembling voice and scarred hands, don't trade your birthright for rules. The problem? Many didn't listen, just like now. We romanticize freedom but still crave the control of a checklist. We call it discipline when it's just fear. We call it holiness when it's just pride. And the spirit of legalism loves nothing more than watching free people willingly rebuild their prisons. What makes Paul dangerous isn't his theology, it's his testimony. Because if he could be saved, it wrecks our scale. It tells us that salvation isn't a reward for being less sinful, it's a miracle for the worst of us. And that scares people, especially those who've worked hard to look good. Paul is the death blow to merit-based faith. He stands as living proof that God's grace is not only unfair, it's scandalous. It's not safe. It doesn't behave. And it doesn't ask permission. That's why the gospel isn't liked. It's feared. So before you say you want a Damascus moment, ask yourself this. Are you ready to lose everything you thought was right? Are you ready to be misunderstood, rejected, and undone? Because grace doesn't just save, it slays. It kills the old you without a funeral. And when you rise, no one throws a party. They watch, they whisper, they wait. And in that tension, you walk forward anyway. That's what makes the gospel beautiful. It doesn't promise applause. It offers truth and dares you to live like it's enough. The tragedy of Galatia wasn't rebellion, it was regression. These weren't pagans turning from God. These were believers sliding back into bondage, eyes wide open. Paul didn't find them lost in sin. He found them shackled by righteousness. That's the twist no one preaches about. You can chase godliness and still crucify grace. The Galatians weren't worshiping idols. They were adding rules, circumcision, ceremonies, traditions, not to reject Christ but to upgrade him, to perfect what they thought was incomplete. And Paul saw it for what it really was, spiritual treason dressed as devotion, because deep down, legalism feels safer. It gives us rails to run on. It lets us measure, compare, prove. A grace that expects nothing feels threatening. So we add, faith is great, but let's include obedience. Let's secure it with behavior. Let's measure it with performance. But every addition to grace is subtraction from the cross. And Paul, who once built his entire life on performance, was watching others build the same fragile house. He saw the foundation cracking. And he wasn't angry because they betrayed him. He was furious because they were betraying freedom. The law had always been a mirror, not a ladder. It showed sin, but couldn't clean it. And Paul knew that too. Well, he'd spent his youth polishing that mirror until it cut him. So when he says, if righteousness could come through the law, then Christ died for nothing, it wasn't a theological theory. It was a scar. He was screaming through ink, don't make his blood irrelevant. Because once you start depending on your performance to stay saved, every failure becomes a death sentence, and grace becomes just another rule book. Even more twisted, Paul wasn't just fighting doctrine, he was fighting PR. The Judaizers didn't show up with pitchforks, they showed up with scrolls, smiles, and Jerusalem credentials. They didn't say, reject Jesus. They said, honor Moses. They sounded biblical, logical, respectable. And that's the danger of deception. It doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like tradition. It feels like caution. It sells as reverence. And in the name of safety, they were sabotaging salvation. Paul knew if they succeeded, the entire church would drift, not into sin, but into self-reliance, the deadliest religion of all. And here's where it gets modern. We may not demand circumcision, but we've built our own performance rituals. Pray more, fast harder, post your quiet time, serve until you collapse, smile through burnout. Never admit doubt. Make sure your holiness is visible, or it doesn't count. We parade exhaustion as evidence of obedience. We spiritualize hustle. We baptize anxiety. And all the while, grace weeps in the background, ignored, because we're too busy trying to look like we deserve what was never meant to be earned. Paul wasn't writing to atheists. He was writing to us. To every tired soul who wonders if they're enough. To every believer afraid they've fallen short again. To every churchgoer crushed under the weight of trying harder. The gospel is not about climbing higher, it's about dying to the ladder. Paul doesn't just teach grace, he defends it like a soldier guarding a treasure. Because he knows once you lose grace, you don't become a better Christian, you become a better Pharisee. And the world doesn't need more Pharisees. It needs more people who've been wrecked and remade by mercy. So Paul gives them a choice. If you get circumcised, he says, Christ will be of no value to you. That sounds harsh, but here's the truth. You can't hold grace in one hand and law in the other. You'll end up clinging to whichever feels safer. And performance always feels safer until it doesn't. Until the day you fail. Until you snap under pressure. Until the weight breaks you. Then you realize grace was the only thing that ever held you together. But by then, some people have already walked too far into the fog of earning. And what does Paul say to do? Not negotiate, not tweak the gospel. He says, stand firm, don't move, don't slide, don't compromise. Because the second you start making small allowances, just one ritual, just one little rule, you're already slipping. Legalism doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It whispers, it flatters, it makes you feel holy, until you're so deep in fear, you forget what freedom even felt like. Paul draws a line in the sand. It's grace or law, freedom or performance, sonship or slavery. And the hardest part? Most of us don't even realize we're in chains until someone rips them off. But Paul doesn't end with fear. He ends with fire. He talks about being crucified to the world, about no longer boasting in anything but the cross. In modern terms, that means this. I don't flex my spiritual habits. I don't boast in my purity, my theology, my tithing record. I boast in one thing, that Jesus took my place, that I had nothing, and he gave everything, that I failed, and he finished it. And in a world obsessed with filters, achievements, and digital holiness, that kind of humility is revolutionary. So what do? We reject the gospel of performance. We stop trying to become acceptable. We believe we already are. Not because we earned it, but because Jesus declared it. We stop chasing spiritual resumes. We start resting in sonship. We stop measuring holiness by exhaustion. We start measuring it by surrender. And when legalism whispers, we answer with truth. We declare like Paul, "It is for freedom that Christ set me free. I will not return to a yoke of slavery." And we live like grace is real, even when it's scandalous, because the real threat to the gospel today isn't atheism. It's religion. Without grace, it's Christianity without Christ. It's obedience without joy. The Galatians weren't rebels. They were sincere, passionate, faithful, and still deceived. So let's not get comfortable just because we're busy. Let's not confuse discipline with faith. Let's not wear burnout as a badge. Instead, let's tear down every altar we've built to our own performance. Let's walk away from the chains we labeled righteousness. And let's dare to live as sons and daughters, not slaves who forgot they were freed.